Good morning and good day. Welcome to 3:15 o'clock, that very channel where the unspoken becomes unforgettable. Do you have the courage to explore the stories they always wanted to hide from you? This is not just a horror channel. This is a place where silence is shattered by secrets, and every story carries a weight of fear it was never meant to bear. The first story. Marcus woke to the silence and realized it was the most terrible sound in the world, because his heart was no longer beating. The awareness didn't come through pain, sound, or touch. It came through a deafening, all-consuming void in his chest, a deep, yawning emptiness where a rhythm used to live, the very rhythm he had spent his life listening to through a stethoscope, repairing and ignoring. He tried to inhale, but his ribcage didn't obey. The movement was unnatural, jerky, like a fish gasping on a shore. He blinked, trying to clear the haze from his eyes. Light. Bright, cold, merciless light from surgical lamps. He knew this light. He had spent thousands of hours under it. He was lying on his back. The cold surface of the operating table leached the heat from his spine through the thin sheet. He tried to move his arms. They were resting on special armrests, loosely secured by straps. His legs were also restrained. Panic, sharp and blind, slammed into his brain but found no outlet. There was nowhere for it to run. No racing heartbeat, no adrenaline rush, no stomach cramps. His body was an empty, lifeless shell where his mind was trapped, clinging madly to life. Marcus rolled his eyes, trying to see his chest, and he saw. His ribcage had been opened with a neat sternal incision, exactly like the hundreds he had made himself. His ribs were parted by a metal retractor, but inside wasn't living, pulsating muscle tissue. Inside was a void, just a few tubes and wires leading into a dark depth, and right in the middle, where his heart should have been, protruded a small chrome cylinder, like an old-fashioned metronome. Its pendulum swung back and forth with a steady mechanical click. Tick-tock, tick-tock. This sound was the only one in the tomb-like silence. It was louder than any scream. Marcus, trembling with a body that could no longer tremble, turned his head. A vital signs monitor stood on a table nearby. It was on. The screen showed a flat green line, ECG, flat like the horizon on a dead planet. Blood pressure, 0. Saturation, 0. He was dead. He was a corpse on an operating table. Suddenly the monitor buzzed, and the green line was replaced by text. The letters were large, emotionless, like a statement of fact in a pathology textbook. Dr. Klein, your heart stopped exactly at 3:14 by your own hand. A voice in Marcus's head, his own, arrogant and cynical, whispered, time of death, 3:14. He had always said it with icy precision, never thinking about what those words truly meant. The text on the monitor changed. It is now here in a jar of solution. Marcus's gaze darted around the room. To the left, on another instrument table, stood a large glass vessel like an aquarium. In it, floating in a transparent, slightly cloudy fluid, was his own heart. It was pale, lifeless, with neat cuts diverging from the valves like petals of some hellish flower. Electrodes were attached to it, wires snaking from them to a small box with blinking LEDs. The metronome counts down 180 seconds until the cells begin to die irreversibly. Marcus looked at the metronome. It clicked with relentless regularity. He couldn't see a dial, but he felt every tick like a hammer blow on the anvil of his soul. Surgical instruments are nearby. He looked down. Next to his right hand on the blue sterile drape lay a neat set of instruments. A dissector, clamps, a needle holder with a suture already threaded, polypropylene 4-0, his favorite material. Everything gleamed under the cold light. It was all familiar to the point of nausea. Reassemble it. And start it. Play God with your own life. The last line flashed and flickered like a final warning. Begin. Tick. He had 3 minutes. 5 clicks of the metronome passed while he just lay there in paralyzing horror. His mind, sharpened by years of practice, rebelled. This is impossible, a dream, a hallucination at the moment of death. Maybe he died on the operating table from a stroke. Maybe this is hell. Tock, the sixth click. No, hell would be more merciful. This was too real. The cold feel of steel on his skin, the smell of antiseptic mixed with the sweetish smell of his own flesh and blood. It was surgically precise. It was the work of a master. With a growl that made no sound, he jerked his right hand. The strap on his wrist wasn't tight, more for positioning than restraint. Another jerk, and his hand was free. His numb fingers uncurled with difficulty. He reached for the needle holder. The familiar weight in his hand made him focus. Tick. He operated on pure instinct. His consciousness detached and watched as his own hand, the hand of Dr. Marcus Klein, the best cardiothoracic surgeon in the city, reached for the jar with his heart. His fingers shook. He grabbed the cold, slippery heart and pulled it from the solution. Drops of fluid dripped onto the drape. Tock. He moved it to the yawning void in his chest. Where did it go? He had seen thousands of hearts, but his own... He had only seen his on an MRI. It seemed alien, foreign, and helpless. He shoved it into his chest cavity. It lay crooked. He had to hold it in place with his left hand, which he had also managed to free. Tick instruments. He needed to connect the aorta, the pulmonary artery, the veins. It was delicate work that normally took an hour. He had 160 seconds. He leaned over his own open chest, his brow beading with sweat that no one could wipe away. He stared at the familiar tissues, searching for the cut lines. They were made perfectly cleanly, just how he liked it. Exactly like his own technique. His fingers, to his surprise, remembered every movement. The needle holder described precise arcs, the needle entering the tissue, the suture tightening into neat knots. He worked in silence, in time with the metronome, and the mechanical sound was driving him insane. It was his own pulse, his hour of death. Tock, tick, tock. He finished the aortic anastomosis. Half a minute gone, he moved to the pulmonary trunk. His consciousness began to fog. His peripheral vision started to dim. The cells were dying. His brain was dying without oxygen. He could feel his own mind, his memories, his very self, beginning to crumble like a sandcastle. Suddenly, in the growing chaos, he saw a face. The old man who had died on his table last week. Marcus had been 40 minutes late for the surgery because he was having breakfast with a pharma rep. The man stared at Marcus from the darkness of his own failing consciousness, silently. Then another face, a young woman with a heart defect. He had refused to operate, citing high risk to his impeccable statistics. She stared at him with empty eyes. Tick, they were all here, in the shadows beyond the circle of surgical light. Silent, motionless witnesses. His patients, those he had saved but despised for their weakness, and those he had lost due to his pride, his negligence, his indifference. I'm not God. He wanted to scream, but his lungs were empty and still. I'm just a surgeon. Tock. And then he understood. This wasn't hell. This was an operating room, his operating room, and God here was someone else. Someone who had settled accounts with a surgeon, who fancied himself a deity playing with death. He finished the last suture. The heart lay in its place, white dead. The metronome clicked with frantic speed. Less than 30 seconds left. And started. He remembered the text. How do you start a dead heart? There was no defibrillator. He looked around the table in panic. His gaze fell on the box with the electrodes, the one the wires from the heart were connected to. It had a single button. 10 seconds. Marcus, gathering the last remnants of his will, slammed his fist on the button. A shock ran through the heart. It jerked in his chest like a caught fish. Once, twice, and stopped. Silence. The metronome stopped mid-tick. Its pendulum hung motionless. Marcus froze, staring into the void of his body. Nothing. Despair, cold and final, washed over him. He had lost. And then through the silence came a sound. Faint, timid, lonely. Thump. His heart contracted. A single weak beat. Thump. Thump. Another one. And another. The rhythm was uneven, hesitant, but it was there. It was a beat. His beat. Marcus gasped, and his lungs filled with air. Sharp. Burning. Pain, real, living, a wave of fire rolled through his sternum. He screamed. It was a hoarse, broken, but infinitely beautiful sound. On the monitor, the flat green line jumped. A spike appeared. Another one. Stuttering, flickering, the ECG curve crawled across the screen. Blood pressure, 70/40. Saturation, 85 and rising. He was alive. Tears streamed from his eyes, mixing with the sweat on his face. He laughed, choked, cried from the pain and relief. He had done it. He had saved himself. He had cheated death. He wearily let his head fall back on the pillow, trying to catch the rhythm of his new, fragile but living heart. It beat strangely, with arrhythmia, too loud in the deafening silence of the OR. Thump-thud, 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 and suddenly he realized it wasn't his rhythm. He knew every rhythm, every arrhythmia, every murmur. This was a stranger's heart. It beat with a stubborn, monotonous persistence he had heard only once in his life, on the ECG recording of that very old man who died because he was late. Thump-thud. Thump-thud. The heart he had once failed to save was beating in his chest. A new horror, soul-freezing, seized him. He tried to lift his head to look at the monitor but couldn't. His body no longer obeyed him. The text on the screen changed again. Now it was red. Congratulations, Doctor. You have survived. Your technique is impeccable. Marcus froze, unable to look away. But surgery is not just technique. It is responsibility. You forgot that. You have inserted a stranger's heart. You carry within you those you failed. But every night at 03:14 it will stop, and you will wake to the silence. Every night you will have 180 seconds to remember one of their names, one of their faces. Only redemption will grant you the morning. Enjoy your life, Dr. Klein. You fought so hard for it. The screen went dark. Marcus lay in the silence, broken only by the steady foreign beating in his chest. Thump-thud, thump-thud, thump-thud. He listened to it, and with every beat a new face surfaced in his memory. A new name, a new life he was now responsible for. He closed his eyes. For the first time in his life, Dr. Marcus Klein, the cynical cardiothoracic surgeon, was afraid to fall asleep. He was afraid of the silence that awaited him at exactly 03:14, and of an awakening that would last an eternity. The second story. For her 18th birthday, Caroline found the strength to pry her eyelids open and saw her only gift, her right hand, welded shut to the handle of a huge lever in the middle of an abandoned workshop. Consciousness returned to her slowly, as if surfacing from the depths of black, oily water. Smell came first. The scent of rusty metal, old dust, and something acrid, chemical. It smelled of welding. Then hearing, an obsessive, monotonous ticking coming from somewhere to the right, and her own ragged, hoarse gasp. And finally, touch. An icy cold that had seized her entire body, and a dull, throbbing pain in her right wrist. She tried to move her hand, but couldn't. Not because it was numb, because it was immovable, shackled, attached. Caroline forced herself to focus her gaze. Her hand, usually well-groomed with a perfect manicure, lay on a massive metal handle painted a dirty green. The skin around her wrist was burned, blistered, and streaked with dark, almost black smears. A rough, uneven seam of solidified metal ran from her hand to the handle, the mark of a weld. This wasn't a handcuff. It was a fusion. Her flesh and blood had become part of this mechanism. A wild, animalistic terror made her jerk, but the movement was stopped by a short chain, fastened by a heavy collar to her neck and leading back into the wall behind her. The links clanked, digging into her collarbones. She was on a leash, like a dog. Panic, sharp and blind, slammed into her temples. She screamed. The sound came out hoarse and weak, swallowed by the oppressive silence of this place. She looked around, forcing her eyes to adjust to the gloom. She was in a huge abandoned workshop. High ceilings were lost in darkness, from which hung shreds of old cobwebs like funeral shrouds. Machines, the skeletons of conveyor belts and piles of unrecognizable scrap metal stood everywhere. The air was still and stale. The only source of light, was a single bare light bulb under a shade, hanging from the ceiling in the middle of the workshop, forming a grim island of light in an ocean of darkness. And in that light, she saw him. Duke. He was sitting on a simple wooden chair about 20 meters away from her on the other side of the circle of light. His powerful frame, usually so relaxed and confident, was tense to the limit. Thick chains wrapped around his torso, chaining him to the back of the chair. His arms were wrenched behind his back. But that wasn't the worst part. His head was fixed in place by a metal band, preventing it from moving. And his eyes were wide open, filled with silent, absolute horror. Small but clearly heavy lead weights rested on his eyelids, preventing him from blinking. Tears streamed continuously down his cheeks, but he couldn't close his eyes to wipe them away. Right in front of his face, an inch from his nose, a pendulum was paused at its highest point. It was a long, narrow strip of steel polished to a mirror shine, sharpened to a razor's edge along its bottom side. It looked like a blade, a giant, perfect blade. The pendulum was suspended from a complex mechanism, which in turn was connected by a system of gears, cables, and levers to the very green monster her hand was welded to. Tick-tock, tick-tock, the sound was coming from there. It was the sound of a timer counting down the seconds until the blade fell. Caroline felt her own heart hammering in her chest, trying to break free. She pulled on the lever again, instinctively trying to push it away from herself. And at that same moment the pendulum shuddered and moved an inch away from Duke's face. She froze. Understood. Her hand was holding the lever in a neutral, safe position. Opposite her, on a wall she hadn't immediately discerned in the dark, an inscription lit up, as if drawn by an invisible hand with glowing paint. Caroline, your tongue was always your weapon. She gasped, feeling a stab of conscience, a feeling long forgotten and scorched away by her. Today, your hand will be the instrument of salvation. The words appeared one after another, cold and impersonal. As long as you hold the lever, the pendulum is still. She looked at Duke. He wasn't looking at her. His gaze was fixed on the blade hovering before his face. He was breathing shallowly, raggedly, afraid that even a breath would bring the steel closer. But no, it is welded to your hand permanently. Caroline looked again at her wrist, at the ugly seam of metal and flesh, a deadly symbiosis. To let it go, you will have to leave your hand here. The final line flashed and held, bright and clear. Choose, his life or your hand. The silence was broken only by the ticking mechanism and Duke's ragged moan. Caroline felt goosebumps run down her spine. This was not a dream. This was an elaborate, monstrous reality. Duke, she croaked. Duke, can you hear me? He slowly, as if with great effort, shifted his gaze from the blade to her. His eyes held not just fear. They held betrayal, pain, and a question. What's happening? Her voice broke. Who did this? He tried to say something, but only a hoarse, silent whisper escaped his throat. So he just shook his head, a tiny movement that made his eyelids tremble and the lead weight sway threateningly. Tick-tock, tick-tock. The sound counted the seconds. Her life until this moment had seemed so important, full of drama and intrigue. Now it was reduced to this. Holding a heavy lever, feeling the pain in her burned wrist, and looking into the eyes of a man whom she had. Memory, like a pendulum, swung into the past. Duke, her old friend, her brother's friend to be exact. A simple, honest guy with golden hands, a mechanic. He had always been a little in love with her, and she knew it. And she used it. Asked him to fix her car on his day off, help her move, lend her money until payday. He never refused. Then there was that party, and her friend Sarah's missing brooch, an expensive antique brooch, and also jealousy. Sarah was flirting with a guy Caroline liked, and that was enough. She hadn't planned it in advance. It just came out easily and naturally, as always. Over a glass of wine, she said to Sarah with feigned sympathy, You know, I stopped by Duke's garage yesterday. He was just hiding something shiny in his toolbox. Maybe I imagined it. That hint was enough. Sarah, hot-headed and impulsive, immediately called Duke, accused him of theft. yelled at him, demanded it back. He denied it, fumbled, blushed, looked completely guilty. Caroline, with artfully feigned embarrassment, confirmed his guilt. The rumor spread instantly. Duke, yeah, a thief. Caroline saw it herself. He was no longer allowed into their friends' houses. Clients tore up contracts. His reputation as an honest craftsman was destroyed in an instant. He tried to defend himself, but against Caroline's easy, poisonous whisper, his clumsy excuses were powerless. The brooch, of course, was found a week later. It had rolled under the bed. Sarah apologized, but a shadow of suspicion remained. The phrase "no smoke without fire" hung around Duke like a bad smell. Caroline had forgotten about it the next day. For her, it was just another episode, another story where she was the center of attention. She never even thought to call and apologize, and now he was sitting there chained, staring death in the face. Because of her, because of her lie. "I'm sorry," she breathed, and the words sounded pathetic and fake even to her own ears. "Duke, forgive me. I didn't mean to." He looked at her again, and in his gaze there was no longer a question. There was understanding. He knew. He knew why he was here, and why she was here. Suddenly her hand twitched, an involuntary spasm caused by fatigue and pain. The lever shuddered and moved an inch forward. Click. A gear shifted somewhere in the mechanism. The pendulum began to move with a quiet hissing sound. Slow, inexorable. It swung to the side, gaining momentum. "No!" screamed Caroline and pulled the lever back with all her might. The muscles in her shoulder and back strained to the point of cracking. The metal groaned. The pendulum, before reaching its apex, slowed and stopped. She froze like that, tense, with her aching arm outstretched, holding the mechanism of death by a thread. Duke squeezed his eyes shut, as much as the weights on his eyelids allowed, and exhaled in relief. Thus began their standoff. Time lost all meaning. It was measured only by the ticking of the mechanism and the burning pain in her muscles. Her arm went numb, her shoulder was on fire. Every tiny movement, every breath, made the lever tremble and the pendulum stir, threatening to begin its deadly work. She tried to find another way out. Examine the chain on her neck. It was welded to the wall. Scream for help. Only an echo answered her in the empty workshop. Try to kick the lever. It caused such a dangerous oscillation in the system that she almost let go out of fear. There was no way out. Only a choice, his life or her hand. She looked at Duke. He wasn't crying anymore. He just looked at her, and his gaze held no hatred. There was pity and acceptance. He seemed resigned to his fate, resigned to her choosing herself, as always, and that was the most terrifying thing. Another spasm shot through her arm. The muscles, exhausted from the immobile tension, were giving up. Her fingers loosened their grip on their own. The lever grated forward. Click, click, click. The pendulum swung. The hissing grew louder. The blade described an arc, whizzing past an inch from Duke's face. "Hold it," he croaked, finding his voice for the first time. "For God's sake, hold it." Caroline dug the fingers of her left hand into her right wrist, trying to force it to stay in place. The pain became unbearable. She cried, sobbed, begged someone for mercy, but there was no mercy. Only the cold metal fused into her flesh and the relentless mechanics of retribution. She remembered others. Not just Duke. The teacher she'd accused of harassment because he gave her a bad grade. The classmate who was expelled from college because of rumors Caroline started about cheating. The neighbor she'd called a maniac in a fit of anger, and who was then harassed by everyone in the building for months. Her tongue had truly been a weapon, a sharpened, lethal one, and she had fired it at those around her without aiming, just for fun, for the feeling of power, for a momentary advantage, and now the bill had been presented. The lever shuddered again. She was losing strength. The pendulum swung wider with each pass, getting closer to Duke's face. He wasn't screaming anymore. He watched the blade coming straight for him, and his lips silently mouthed something. A prayer, a curse. Caroline understood. She couldn't hold this forever. Sooner or later her strength would fail, and the pendulum would do its work. She would die here of thirst and exhaustion, chained to a wall, watching an innocent man die because of her weakness. The other option was unthinkable. Leave her hand here? Become a cripple? At 18, no, it was impossible. Tick-tock, tick-tock. The blade whistled a millimeter from Duke's nose. No, it was possible. The thought was so monstrous that it overshadowed the pain for a second. She looked at her wrist, at the ugly scar of metal and flesh. This was no longer her hand. It was a tool, part of the torture machine. And as long as it was attached to her, she remained the executioner. To save Duke, she had to stop being the executioner, to save herself, not physically. But what was left of her, she had to pay. She looked at Duke, straight in the eyes. "Forgive me," she said, and this time it sounded sincere. "For everything." He didn't answer. He saw the decision in her eyes. Caroline looked at the lever, at her hand. She took a deep breath. Then another. She searched for a drop of rage, despair, strength, anything that could help her do this, but found only emptiness. And acceptance. She braced her feet against the floor, leaned her body back, tightening the chain around her neck. She brought her left hand behind her back, felt around on the floor among the debris for what she was looking for. A fragment of brick. Heavy and rough, the pendulum hissed downward, straight toward Duke's face. Caroline squeezed her eyes shut, and with all her might, she brought the brick down on the weld. There was a deafening dry crunch. Not of metal, bone. Agony so white and all-consuming that she blacked out for a second, hanging from the chain. The world disappeared, filled only with one thing: indescribable pain. She fell to her knees and the chain jerked painfully at her neck. Her right hand, or what was left of it, remained welded to the lever, dangling limply from a horrific makeshift hinge of flesh and metal. Blood gushed from the stump sticking out of her sleeve. The lever, freed from her efforts, slammed forward with a crash. Click! The mechanism roared. Gears spun, cables tautened. The pendulum, having reached its highest point, froze, and then slowly, very slowly, began to move backward, retracting into its housing under the ceiling. The ticking stopped. Silence fell, broken only by her ragged, hoarse sobs and Duke's heavy breathing. The chains binding him clanked open. The lead weights fell from his eyelids onto the floor with a dull thud. He slowly, stunned, raised his hands and touched his face as if checking it was still there. Then he looked at her. She was on her knees, bleeding out, clutching the bloody stump to her chest, crying quietly from pain and shock. He stood up, swaying, and took a step toward her. Then another. He came very close, stopping at the edge of the circle of light. His eyes were filled with confusion, pain, shock, and a hint of something else. Gratitude? No. More like an understanding of the price she had paid. He looked at her mutilated hand, at the lever impaled by her hand like a trophy, then back at her. Without saying a word, he turned around and walked slowly away, disappearing into the darkness of the workshop. Caroline was left alone, chained to a wall, bleeding out, staring at the terrible price of her past life, welded to an iron lever. Somewhere far away, a door slammed. The silence became absolute, and in that silence she heard the truth for the first time, and it was more terrifying than any blade. The third story. Jack woke up to something licking his fingers and saw a hungry Doberman tied to his wrist, the very same one he had been feeding by his entrance, whose hungry and devoted eyes now glowed in the dark. The sensation was strange, intrusive, and wet. A rough, warm tongue slid over his skin, and the first vague thought that flashed through his not fully awake consciousness was, the cat. Then he remembered he didn't have a cat. He couldn't. He hated animals. He tried to pull his hand away, but it was heavy, stiff, and tied. An unfamiliar metallic cold bit into his wrist like a bracelet. Jack blinked, chasing away the remnants of sleep. Damp, moldy air hit his nostrils. He was lying on his back on the cold concrete floor. There was impenetrable darkness all around. except for a single beam of light falling from above, like a spotlight on a stage. And in that beam he saw it, the Doberman. The chain, the collar, a strong thick chain, short, no more than a meter long, connected the heavy steel collar on the dog's neck to a similar bracelet on Jack's right wrist. The dog sat hunched over, its ribs protruding from under its smooth, taut skin. It was emaciated to the extreme. Every muscle, every tendon was visible beneath a thin layer of fur, making it look like an anatomical drawing. But its eyes were full of such boundless, unconditional devotion that it became physically uncomfortable. It stretched out and licked Jack's hand again, whining softly and plaintively. It recognized him. It saw him as its savior. Jack jerked, trying to get up. The metal clanked, biting painfully into his skin. He wasn't just chained to the dog. He was chained to it, and it was chained to a heavy floor and ceiling-mounted cast-iron pipe. The rusty, massive links offered no hope of breaking free. Panic, cold and sharp, began to creep up his throat. But Jack was used to suppressing it. He wasn't one to give in to fear. He looked around. They were in a small, flooded basement. The walls, made of porous old brick, were covered in green slime and mold. Water. Cold, murky, dirty water reached up to his waist and almost to the dog's chest. It was slowly, almost imperceptibly rising. A steady, rhythmic gurgling sound came from somewhere. Water was flowing into the basement, and then he saw the chair. An ordinary wooden chair standing on a raised platform, on some old boxy cabinet, so it was still above water for now. Two objects lay on the seat. The first, a sharp, long cleaver. Its blade glinted in the dim light, casting ominous gleams on the wool. It was clean, almost sterile, as if freshly sharpened for some important task. Next to the cleaver was a bowl, an ordinary enameled bowl worn with chipped paint. It was full of food, canned stewed beef pâté, his favorite. The thick, rich aroma of meat mixed with the smell of stagnant water, creating an unbearably disgusting mixture. Jack felt his stomach cramp. He hadn't eaten. He couldn't remember the last time he ate. Hunger awoke in him instantly, animalistic and demanding. The Doberman also caught the scent. It turned its narrow, emaciated head towards the chair, its nostrils quivering. A quiet, full of longing and hope, moan escaped its throat. It looked at Jack, then at the bowl, then back at Jack. Its tail, docked to a short stub, quivered slightly. It was waiting for its friend, its feeder, to share, as he had done by the entrance, throwing pieces of sausage from the height of his superiority. Suddenly, from nowhere, from a speaker hidden in the darkness, a voice sounded. Calm even, without a single emotion, synthesized or deliberately impersonal. Jack. Jack flinched, yanking the chain. The dog yelped in fright. You always considered yourself above those you tamed and betrayed. The voice was quiet, but each word hit its mark like a hammer on a nail. Your life depends on your pet. Jack tried to shout something, to demand answers, but the voice overrode him. He has been starving for a week. You have not. A week. Jack looked at the dog with a new, chilling understanding. Its exhaustion, its sunken sides, and its eyes burning with hunger now took on a new, terrifying meaning. The tool is on the chair. Jack's gaze automatically shifted to the cleaver. Feed him. A pause. The water lapped quietly against his chest. The chain cannot be sawn, only chopped. Jack froze. His mind, sharp and cynical, was already calculating options. Chop. What? The chain. But it was thick, link by link. It would take a long time to chop, or... He looked at the dog's thin, emaciated leg, pressed against the collar. Or chop it, or his own hand. No, that was madness. Decide quickly. The water level is slowly but steadily rising. The voice fell silent. The silence was broken only by the gurgling water, the dog's whining, and his own rapid breathing. Jack lunged for the chair. The chain tightened, painfully jerking his wrist and the dog's neck. The dog howled in pain and confusion. The chair was about 30 centimeters away. He couldn't reach it. Meanwhile, the water had risen another centimeter. It was now up to the dog's neck. Jack felt its cold tremble transmitted to him through the chain. He had to reach it. The cleaver, the bowl, feed him. The thought was disgusting. Feed this skinny, stinking creature while he himself was dying of hunger? Give it the food? No, it wasn't right. It was revolting. The Doberman, as if reading his thoughts, whined again and tried to lick his hand. Its tongue was no longer as warm. Jack jerked his hand away sharply. "Get off!" he rasped, and his own voice, angry and frightened, sounded alien in this damp dungeon. The dog pinned its ears back. The whining ceased. Uncertainty and pain appeared in its eyes, but the devotion didn't vanish. It was still waiting for his help. The water was rising. It now covered the dog's back. The dog began to paddle restlessly with its paws, trying to keep its head above the surface. Its breathing became rapid and ragged. Jack looked around, searching for something, anything that could help. A crowbar, a brick, any tool. But there was only water, slime, and impenetrable darkness beyond the beam of light. His gaze fell on the cleaver again, and on the bowl. An idea came suddenly, dirty and shiny like the blade of a knife. He couldn't reach the chair, but the dog could. If he could lure it closer to the chair, tighten the chain, maybe then he could reach the cleaver, and to do that he needed to bait it. With what? Food. He looked at the bowl of pâté. He looked at the dog, which was using its last strength to avoid drowning. Feed him. The order echoed in his head, but now he heard it differently. This wasn't an act of mercy. It was a tactical move, a deception. He would give the dog hope and use its trust to get to the weapon. "Hey, boy." His voice sounded hoarse and unnaturally affectionate. "Hey, good boy." The dog perked up, its ears twitching. It looked at him with hope. "Want some food?" Jack nodded towards the bowl. "See? Food. Tasty food." The dog whined, tried to swim towards the chair, but the short chain wouldn't let it get closer. It just thrashed hopelessly in place. "I'll give it to you," Jack lied. "Help me. Swim over here to me." He began to pull the chain gently towards himself, calling the dog. The Doberman, trusting as a child, obeyed. It made a few uncertain strokes in his direction, tightening the chain. Jack's heart pounded. It was working. A little more, and the chain would be taut enough for him to stretch out and reach the leg of the chair with his fingertips. "Come on. Come on," he encouraged it, already seeing his fingers closing around the handle of the cleaver in his mind. The dog, urged on by his voice and the smell of food, made a final effort and swam right up to Jack, pressing its muzzle against his chest. The chain was taut as a string. Jack, gritting his teeth, stretched out his free left hand. His muscles burned. The tips of his fingers brushed against the wet wood of the chair leg and slipped off. He was a millimeter short. "Damn it," he swore. Meanwhile, the water had risen even higher. It was now reaching the dog's chin. The dog coughed, choking, its eyes bulging with fear. It instinctively began to cling to Jack, trying to climb onto him to save itself from the water. Paws with claws scraped over his skin, leaving red streaks. Dirty water splashed into his face. "Get off!" Jack screamed in panic, pushing the drowning animal away. "Get away, you beast!" But the dog, crazed with fear and suffocation, didn't understand. It saw him as the only solid support, an island of salvation. It clung to him more and more fiercely, its whining turning into hoarse, gurgling screams. Jack realized he was drowning with it. His tactic had failed. His deception had only resulted in the dog now pulling him down. Blind, helpless rage seized him. It was all because of this stupid animal, because of its weakness, its annoying devotion. And then his gaze fell on his own right hand, on the hand to which the chain was attached, and on the dog's leg, pressed against the collar just half a meter away from him. The chain cannot be sawn, only chopped. A new plan, terrible and final, was born in his head. He wouldn't chop the chain. He wouldn't chop his own hand. He would chop the dog's leg, free himself from this dead weight. This creature would die anyway. Why should it suffer? It would be merciful, and then he would get the cleaver, chop the chain at the pipe, and get out of here. He would eat the pâté himself. He would survive. He reached for the chair again. This time his movements were sharp, decisive. Desperation gave him strength. His fingers again slid over the leg, and found something. A protrusion, a knot. He grabbed it. Holding his breath, he began to pull the chair towards him. The wood creaked, scraping against the cabinet. The bowl of pâté shook, almost falling. A little more. 1 more centimeter. The Doberman, feeling the movement, looked at him with hope again. It didn't understand what its feeder was preparing for its dinner. The chair slid off the cabinet with a crash and fell into the water, but Jack managed to grab it by the back. He held it afloat. The cleaver in the bowl remained on the seat like on a raft. The water was now up to Jack's armpits. The dog was already completely submerged, only its muzzle with wide-open nostrils occasionally breaking the surface to gulp air with a rasping, frightening sound. It was thrashing in its death throes. There was no time. Jack grabbed the cleaver. The handle fit comfortably in his palm. The blade was heavy and lethally sharp. He looked at the dog. It looked at him. In its eyes, full of water and fear, a spark of hope still flickered. It still believed he would save it. "Sorry," Jack whispered. But it wasn't addressed to the dog. It was to himself, to stifle the last remnants of something human inside. He raised the cleaver. The dog, seeing the sudden movement, instinctively jerked away, exposing not its leg, but its neck to the blow. Jack had already begun the chopping motion. Impossible to stop. The blade whistled through the air and the murky water and came down on the collar. There was a soft, wet crunch and a metallic clang. The blow was accurate and terrifying in its force. The Doberman let out a short, cut-off scream that was immediately choked by water. The chain jerked and suddenly went slack. Jack, without looking at what he had done, pulled his hand towards himself. The chain slid freely through the water. At its end, dangling, was the bloody collar and part of what had been attached to it. He was free. Of the dog, he frantically began chopping the chain at the base, at the pipe. The links, softened by rust, didn't give way immediately. The metal screeched, sparks flying. After the 5th blow, the chain broke open. He was completely free. He breathed heavily, leaning against the pipe. The water reached his chin. He looked at what was floating next to him in the water and immediately vomited. Clear bile and stomach acid. There was nothing to eat. He remembered the bowl. He grabbed it. He was so hungry he was ready to eat even here, in this stagnant water next to. He scooped up the thick pâté with his fingers and shoved it into his mouth. He expected an explosion of taste, satiety, life. But instead his mouth was filled with a vile, sweet, bitter, chemical taste. It wasn't pâté, it was bait. A mixture of waste, flavorings, and something else, inedible and poisonous. He spat out the mass, gagging again. He had been tricked. The food was fake, just like his hope. The same indifferent voice came from the speaker again. "You made your choice, Jack. You always chose yourself. Congratulations, you are free." The voice fell silent. The water slowly continued to rise, now reaching his mouth. He was free of the chains, but he was trapped in a flooded basement, without food, and with what he had just done. He flung the bowl away and in despair began feeling the walls, looking for an exit, a hatch, any salvation, and then his fingers touched a sticky, damp surface. He pulled his hand back and looked. On the wall, just above the water level, someone had drawn with paint or scratched with a blade a crude, childlike drawing. A few stick figures and a dog, and a crooked, sloppy inscription, "Why did you leave me? I loved you." It was his little sister's handwriting. 7 years old, she adored stray animals and secretly brought them food until he put a stop to it, cruelly and finally, and then all the puzzle pieces fell into place. All his exploits. The cat he hung by its paw on a rope. The puppies he drowned in a sack in the pond. The old alcoholic from whom he took his last money and burned his wretched dwelling, just to watch him try to put out the fire with his only jacket. He had always considered them weak, dirty, beneath him. Toys for his amusement, and now he was in their skin. Hungry, cornered, abandoned, and the most terrible judgment had not come from a human. It had come from the most defenseless and devoted creature he could betray. The water covered his mouth. He stood on tiptoe, tilting his head back to catch the last gulps of air near the ceiling, and in the light of the single beam, he saw what was floating next to his face, the empty, bloodied collar. And in the buckle of the collar, as in a mirror, his own face was reflected, distorted by horror, hunger, and realization. He screamed, and water rushed into his mouth, silently and mercilessly sealing his sentence. His last thought was that the dog had probably still loved him in the instant the blade cut its throat. And that thought was more terrifying than death itself. The fourth story. Sarah came to her senses from a familiar grinding sound, the sound of a whetstone, but realized that this time she wasn't sharpening her scalpel, but was lying on a cold table, and the sound was coming from right next to her temple. She knew that rhythm better than her own heartbeat. The steady, vibrating hum, followed by the hissing, almost whispering slide of steel on a wet stone. She performed this ritual before every surgery, sharpening her tools to a razor's edge. It was her sacred dance, the anticipation of control, power, perfection. But now something was wrong. Cold, icy, bone-chilling cold beneath her back. She was lying down, not standing at the instrument table, but lying on a motionless, hard surface. She tried to wiggle her fingers, unsuccessfully. Her arms and legs were securely fastened with wide leather straps. Another strap constricted her chest, preventing her from sitting up. Panic, sharp and swift as an adrenaline injection, hit her brain. She tried to scream, but only a hoarse, soundless groan escaped her throat. Her mouth was forcibly opened and held open by a rubber mouthguard, as under general anesthesia. She rolled her eyes, trying to see the source of the sound, and she saw it. A centimeter from her right temple, right above her ear, a small grinding disc was spinning. Sparks from the metal being sharpened on it fell onto her cheek, burning her skin with microscopic points of pain. She could smell scorched metal and ozone, and behind it all, in the semi-darkness, a figure in a sterile surgical gown and mask was leaning over her. On its head was a surgical magnifying binocular, a loupe, and through its lenses, Sarah saw eyes. Eyes she had seen almost every day for the past 5 years. Teresa, her assistant. Quiet, unnoticeable, perfectly obedient Teresa. But now those eyes, usually cast down at the floor or obediently watching her hands during surgery, were fixed directly on her. And in them burned a strange, motionless, insane gleam. The gleam of absolute, unconditional conviction. The grinding stopped. Teresa turned off the sharpener and set it aside. The tool remained in her hand, but it wasn't an elegant scalpel, a delicate clamp, or Metzenbaum scissors. It was a huge old pair of garden shears with massive handles. The very kind used to trim bushes and thick branches. The blades had just been sharpened. They gleamed in the dim light, emanating from a single surgical lamp aimed directly at Sarah's face. Teresa slowly, almost tenderly, ran a finger along the edge of the blade, checking its sharpness. A drop of blood welled up on her skin. She didn't blink. Sarah thrashed hysterically, trying to break free from her restraints. The straps dug into her skin, leaving red welts. Muffled animalistic sounds erupted from her throat. She shook her head, trying to dislodge the mouthguard, but it held fast. Teresa watched this for a few seconds, her gaze cold and analytical, like a pathologist's. It was the exact same gaze Sarah used to assess her patients during initial consultations. Then Teresa raised her free hand and pointed somewhere to the side. Sarah, rolling her eyes, followed the gesture. A flat monitor hung on the wall within her line of sight. It was black, and suddenly text lit up on it. White letters on a black background, emotionless, like a diagnosis on a medical chart. Dr. Sarah. Sarah froze, staring at the screen, feeling her heart ready to burst from her chest. For 20 years you decided what was ugly about your patients. The words appeared one after another, leisurely and relentless. Today it's your turn. Teresa brought the blades of the shears close to Sarah's face, not touching the skin, just moving them a centimeter from the tip of her nose, as if mapping out the lines of future incisions. Your assistant, whom you humiliated for years, is now your surgeon. Sarah looked at Teresa. She remembered everything, all her barbs about her mousy appearance, her unsuccessful personal life, her lack of ambition. She called her little grey mouse not behind her back, but right in the operating room in front of the nurses. She made her redo perfectly crafted schedules just because she was in a bad mood. She blamed her for every one of her own mistakes. Her tools are garden shears and a blowtorch. A blowtorch. Sarah noticed it out of the corner of her eye. It stood on another table next to a soldering iron and other non-medical tools. Its hose was connected to a small gas cylinder. The flame at its tip was even, blue, and lethally dangerous. She will correct you until you admit that the true ugliness was always inside you. Sarah thrashed again in hysterics. Tears streamed from her eyes, flooding her temples and ears. She shook her head, trying to say, "No, sorry, let me go." But it all turned into incoherent moaning. "Say it into the microphone." Next to her head on a movable stand hung a microphone, the very one she used to dictate her observations during surgeries, or become her masterpiece. The last line faded. The screen went black. Teresa straightened up. Her eyes behind the loop lenses narrowed. She nodded as if receiving the command to begin the operation. "Beginning correction of the nasolabial fold, doctor," she said in her quiet, always submissive voice. But now it held an icy, inhuman certainty. "In your own opinion, it's a sign of aging that gives the face a tired and displeased expression." Sarah shook her head, moaned, trying to turn away. But the head restraints held her immobile. Teresa brought the blades of the shears to Sarah's cheek, right to that very deep fold she herself had corrected hundreds of times in her patients with fillers and threads. "Please don't move," Teresa said softly. "Otherwise the correction will be asymmetrical." A disgusting wet crunch sounded. The sharp blade didn't cut, it crushed and tore flesh. Pain, white blinding, pierced Sarah's entire being. She screamed, but the sound stuck in her throat. Blood, warm and sticky, gushed from the wound on her cheek. Teresa leaned back, critically assessing her work. "Needs to be deeper," she stated, and inserted the blades into the wound again. Sarah felt herself losing consciousness from the pain and horror, but some drug administered earlier denied her that mercy. She was fully conscious. She felt everything. Teresa set aside the bloody shears and picked up the blowtorch. "Cauterizing the vessels," she announced, "to avoid hematoma." She pressed a button, and a sinister hiss filled the air. The blue flame touched the wound. The smell of searing meat and burnt skin filled her nostrils, mixing with the smell of her own blood. It was a smell she knew, the smell of coagulation, but now it smelled different. It smelled of her own agony. Sarah rolled her eyes, her body arching in a silent scream. The pain was unbearable. Teresa turned off the torch and picked up the shears again. Moving on to earlobe correction. According to your assessment, patient X had an unesthetic, protruding, Dumbo-like earlobe, ruining the facial geometry. No! Sarah tried to scream, but it was useless. The cold steel closed on her earlobe. Another crunch, another surge of indescribable pain, and the feeling of something being cut off, severed forever. Blood streamed down her neck. Teresa worked methodically, without fuss, with a terrifying surgical precision. She commented on each action, quoting Sarah's own humiliating diagnoses and remarks. Reduction of the nasal alae. Overly wide nostrils, in your opinion, give the face a vulgar expression. Correction of the hairline. A too low forehead is a sign of primitiveness, liposuction of the submental area. A double chin is a sign of laziness and lack of self-control. She used the shears, the blowtorch, sometimes a soldering iron heated in the flame to cauterize and maim. She wasn't just inflicting pain. She was methodically destroying what Sarah considered her perfection, her weapon, her calling card. Sarah lay in a pool of her own blood and tears. Pain became her only universe. She no longer fought. She just waited for the next blow, the next burn, and through this hell, memories broke through. Not of her own beautiful features, but of the faces of her patients. The woman she talked out of lip augmentation, saying her lips already looked like prostitute lips. The teenager who cried after a consultation because Sarah said his nose was a tragedy that needed urgent correction. The man left with a scar after her botched surgery, whom she blamed for poor wound care. She saw their fear, their insecurity, their pain, and she had reveled in it. She felt like a goddess, shaping destinies, deciding who was worthy of beauty and who was not. And now she was in their place. Helpless, humiliated, ugly, Teresa set the tools aside. Her gown was spattered with blood. She walked over to the microphone and tilted it towards Sarah's lips. "Admit it, doctor." Her voice was quiet but clear. "Say it, and it will all be over." Sarah looked at her. Through swollen, blood-filled eyes, she saw not a mad avenger, but a surgeon, the very kind of surgeon she herself had once been. Cold, calculating, confident in her right to maim and change, and she understood that it wouldn't end. Even if she said the words, Teresa wouldn't stop. Because the true ugliness really was inside her, and Teresa was cutting it out with shears and fire, not stopping until the work was complete. She shook her head, refusing. Pride, the very pride that had brought her to this table, was stronger than the instinct for self-preservation. Something like disappointment flashed in Teresa's eyes. Or perhaps satisfaction. "Very well," she said. "Moving on to the main procedure, rhinoplasty. You always said my nose was like a potato. Let's see what's wrong with yours." She picked up a small surgical mallet and a chisel. Sarah closed her eyes. She didn't want to see it. The blow was precise and strong. She heard a crunch that echoed throughout her skull. The pain eclipsed everything. The whole world narrowed to this sound, and the icy gaze behind the loop lenses. She was no longer Dr. Sarah, queen of aesthetic surgery. She was just material, clay in the hands of a sculptor who had decided she was ugly, and in that moment, deep within her mind, ravaged and broken. She finally agreed. She nodded almost imperceptibly, and tried to say something through the mouthguard. Teresa stopped, the mallet freezing in mid-air. She leaned in. "What?" she asked. "Ugly," Sarah hissed, her voice hoarse and alien. "Ugliness. Inside. Me." She said it. She admitted it. Teresa straightened up. She looked at Sarah for a few seconds. Then she slowly placed the mallet and chisel on the table. She removed the bloody gloves and threw them into a metal basin. Then she walked over to the monitor and touched it with her finger. A new message appeared on the screen. "Surgery complete. The masterpiece is ready." Then Teresa walked to a door Sarah hadn't noticed before. She opened it, and another figure appeared on the threshold. A man. He was in regular clothes and held a mirror in his hands. A large one, in a gilded frame, like the one in her own clinic. He silently approached the table and turned the mirror towards Sarah. She saw her reflection. What she saw was not a human face. It was a nightmare, a collage of lacerations, charred skin, bruises, and congealed blood. Her nose was shattered and twisted to the side. Almost nothing remained of her ears. A hole gaped in her cheek, through which her teeth were visible. She was her own worst patient. Her most disgusting masterpiece, a sound not of this world, escaped her throat. It was a groan of absolute, irrevocable despair. Teresa watched her reaction, and finally some emotion appeared in her eyes. Not triumph, not joy, emptiness. "The true ugliness was always inside you, Doctor," she repeated quietly. "We just brought it out for everyone to see." She nodded to the man, and they both left, leaving the door open. Sarah lay alone in the pool of blood, staring into the mirror at her new face. The pain had subsided, replaced by a soul-freezing numbness. She heard the sound of a siren, approaching loud. "Help? Rescue?" She looked at the open door leading to freedom, then again at her reflection in the mirror, and she understood that there was no salvation for her anymore. Even if doctors saved her body, Dr. Sarah was dead. She wasn't killed by the shears or the fire. She was killed by her own reflection. The sirens wailed right outside the window. People in uniforms burst into the room, but Sarah no longer saw them. She was only looking into the mirror, and her mutilated lips, torn by the shears, slowly stretched into the most terrifying, most sincere smile of her life. The fifth story. The first thing Travis felt was the taste of blood in his mouth, and the first thing he saw upon opening his eyes was his wife in an identical metal cage opposite him, with an identical gag soaked in blood in her mouth. It was a thick, coppery, nauseating taste. It filled everything, his tongue, his palate, his throat. It was everywhere, as if he had drunk a bucket of blood. He tried to swallow, to recoil, but couldn't. His body wouldn't obey. It was heavy and stiff. His head was splitting, his temples pounding in time with some internal, alarming rhythm. He forced himself to focus his vision. Semi-darkness. Cold, damp air smelling of mold, rust, and something else. Swedish and chemical. He was sitting on a concrete floor, his back against cold metal bars. He was inside a cage, a small one, about 2 by 2 meters, like a cage for a large wild animal. And directly opposite, 3 meters away, was a second identical cage. And in it, Lisa, his wife. She sat in the same position, her back arched, her eyes wide with horror staring right at him. Tears streamed from her wide, panic-distorted eyes, mingling with blood seeping from under the thick leather strap, biting into her face. A gag just like his. Black, made of rough leather, with a metal buckle at the back, soaked in the same crimson, sticky substance that now flooded his mouth. He lunged forward, tried to scream her name, but only a muffled, suppressed groan escaped his throat. The gag pressed down on his tongue, pushed against his pharynx, triggering his gag reflex. All he could do was look at her. Look and feel an icy wave of horror washing over him, paralyzing his muscles more effectively than any chains. Lisa saw that he was conscious. In her eyes, besides the animal fear, something else flickered. Not hope, no, more like despair multiplied by 2. She shook her head wildly, trying to say something, to communicate something to him. But her sounds were also drowned by the gag. Travis looked around, trying to understand where they were. It looked like an abandoned industrial basement or bunker. High ceilings were lost in darkness, walls of rough concrete. Everywhere, signs of decay and silence. A tomb-like, oppressive silence, broken only by their ragged, hoarse breathing. And then he felt the cold metal on his neck, a heavy, tight-fitting collar. He reached for it with his hands. They weren't tied, and touched a smooth, cold surface. It felt like a collar, wide, massive. He ran his fingers along the inside and gasped, snatching his hand back as if from fire. Sharp, long spikes were attached to the inside of the collar, their points aimed directly at his throat. Any sudden movement, any attempt to force it off, and the spikes would plunge into his neck. He looked at Lisa and saw the exact same device on her thin, fragile neck. A collar of death. His heart hammered, blood rushed to his head. He tried to stand again, grabbed the bars of the cage. They were solid and unyielding. The lock, massive, padlocked, hung on the outside. Suddenly, a click sounded in the basement and a light came on. A bright, blinding beam fell on the space between the cages. There on the concrete floor stood a small metal pedestal, and on it, a single object. A syringe injector with a transparent glass cartridge inside, which a bright yellow liquid sloshed. It looked crystal clear and sterile against the surrounding filth. And then, from hidden speakers somewhere in the darkness under the ceiling, a voice sounded. Synthesized, emotionless, devoid of any human intonation. The voice of a judge or an executioner. Travis. Travis flinched and pressed his back against the bars. Lisa squeezed her eyes shut. You always believed in the poison of betrayal in your blood. The voice was quiet, but every word was uttered with frightening clarity, searing into his consciousness. Now it can be tested. Travis felt goosebumps run down his spine. The taste of blood in his mouth became even more distinct, even more disgusting. The gag in each of your mouths is soaked in a lethal nerve agent. In the cage opposite, Lisa let out a quiet, stifled wail. Her eyes filled with such horror that Travis felt physically sick. He himself felt an icy heat spreading through his body. Poison. They were already poisoned. Right now, this very second. But there is an antidote. Travis's gaze instinctively darted to the lone syringe on the pedestal, to that bright yellow liquid shining like liquid sun. 1. The word sounded like a sentence. 1. Just 1 dose. For 2 people. Inside the injector in the middle of the room. The cages will open in 1 minute. A loud mechanical click sounded somewhere in the silence, and a digital timer lit up on the wall between the cages, showing 60 seconds. The numbers began to relentlessly decrease. 58, 57. Decide which of you deserves it more. Travis looked at Lisa. She was looking at him, and there were no more tears in her eyes. There was only a question, the very question that had hung in their house for years but was never spoken aloud. The one you suspected? Memories flooded Travis like an avalanche. His endless interrogations, his screams, his humiliating searches of her phone, her things. His accusations thrown in her face after any delay, any smile at a stranger, any missed call. He saw betrayal in every glance, in every word. He had poisoned her with his jealousy, suffocated her with his suspicions, locked her in the invisible prison of his sick imagination. Or the one who suspected. Lisa was silent. She was always silent. She justified herself quietly, cried into her pillow, forgave him again and again. And he saw in her silence a confession, in her submission cunning, in her tears theater. Your jealousy was a prison for her.
45.
40, 43. The voice fell silent. All that remained was the ticking of the timer, counting down the seconds to the beginning of the nightmare. Travis felt the first symptoms. Mild dizziness, tingling in his fingertips, weakness in his muscles. This wasn't just a bluff. This was poison. It was working. In the cage opposite, Lisa also shivered. She wrapped her arms around herself, her body shuddering with a spasm. Her eyes pleaded, but for what? To save her, or himself? He couldn't tell. He never could understand what she was really thinking. He yanked the bars of the cage with renewed force, but they didn't even budge. He tried to tear off the gag, but the buckle on the back was fastened tight, and any sharp movement caused the spikes of the collar to dig into the skin of his neck. Tian. Thoughts raced in a whirlwind. One antidote, one life. His or hers. Logic, cold and impartial, screamed at him, You must take it. You are stronger. You will survive. She is weak. She is already on the edge. It was his inner voice, the voice of survival, the one that always put his interests above all else. But there was another voice. A quiet, barely audible one, muffled by years of selfishness. A voice that whispered, You are guilty. You drove her to this. You created this hell. You deserve to die here. She deserves a chance. He looked at Lisa. She had stopped looking at him. She was looking at the syringe, and in her gaze there was no hope. There was resignation, the very same resignation that had driven him crazy all these years, as if she had already accepted her fate, as if she knew what choice he would make. 9. Suddenly Travis felt a cramp in his leg, sharp, painful. His breathing became labored, as if an invisible hand was squeezing his chest. From Lisa's side came a quiet, hoarse cough. The poison was doing its work. He had to decide. Now, who was he? A tyrant ready to kill his wife to save himself? Or the man he had never been? A redeemer? A martyr? 10. 9. The seconds melted away before his eyes. His mind was paralyzed by fear and poison. 6. 5. He saw their life. Not the one that was, but the one that could have been if he hadn't been a monster. Laughter, trust, love. Everything he had destroyed with his distrust. 3. Lisa closed her eyes. She waited him. Travis made a decision. A loud metallic clang echoed. The locks on both cages clicked and sprang open. The doors swung wide. Travis didn't remember how he got outside. Adrenaline, poison, animal terror, all mixed into one fiery cocktail. He rolled across the concrete floor, his body racked with convulsions, his vision blurring. He saw Lisa, weak and exhausted, crawl out of her cage and fall to her knees, breathing heavily. The syringe lay between them, the bright yellow light of life. They looked at each other. And in that look was everything. Their entire marriage. All the pain. All the fear. Travis screamed. He screamed through the gag, covered in blood and poison. It was a scream from his entire being, a scream of despair, remorse and hatred for himself. And he crawled. Not towards the syringe. With his last strength he crawled into a corner, away from the pedestal, pressed his back against the cold wall and closed his eyes. He couldn't watch this. He was giving her the chance. He was admitting his guilt. It was his only, his last, his most difficult act in life. He waited. Waited for the sound of footsteps. Waited for her to take the antidote and inject herself. Waited for her to survive. But the seconds passed and there was no sound. Only his own hoarse, ragged breathing. He opened his eyes. Lisa hadn't moved. She was sitting on the floor just a meter from the syringe and looking at him. Looking with that expression he could never decipher. There was no gratitude in her eyes, no hatred. There was understanding. Then she slowly, very slowly, shook her head and turned away from the injector. She did not take it. She refused her chance, refused her life. Travis couldn't believe his eyes. What was she doing? Why, was it revenge? Suicide? Or did she want to prove something to him? Something he could never understand? He tried to scream at her to take the syringe, to save herself, but his throat no longer obeyed. The poison had paralyzed his muscles. Darkness was gathering before his eyes. The last thing he saw was Lisa's gaze. Calm, almost peaceful, and in it, that terrible truth he had been searching for all these years, and which now, in his death throes, he finally saw. She had never betrayed him. Never. Her only guilt was loving him, and his only guilt was being unable to believe in that love. And now they would die together, in these cages, with gags full of poison in their mouths, with spikes at their throats. He had lost. He had lost even before the cages opened, because his jealousy had indeed become a prison, and the door out of it now led only one way, to nowhere. The darkness swallowed him whole. The last thing he felt was the bitter taste of blood and poison, and the realization that he never found out whose blood was on that gag, his or hers, or maybe it didn't matter. Maybe the poison of betrayal had always been only in him. The sixth story. Nick didn't realize at first that he was being woken up by his own voice, venomously and maliciously telling a friend on the phone all the reasons why his disabled girlfriend had become a burden and how he planned to get rid of her. At first, it was just noise, an annoying nasal hum breaking into the sweet void of sleep. Then the hum gained intonation, sharp, caustic, painfully familiar. His own. You see, she's just become absolutely unbearable. His voice squealed with a fake laugh, constantly whining that it hurts that she's tired. As if I'm to blame that she decided to play mountaineer and fell off that stupid cliff. Nick tried to turn on his side, pull the blanket over his head to muffle this nightmare dream, but he couldn't. His body wouldn't obey. There was no blanket. Beneath him was cold, hard metal. He forced his eyes open. Darkness. His voice, amplified by powerful speakers, filled the entire space, pounding against his eardrums, making every cell in his body vibrate. And her doctors? Endless visits, procedures, bills. I've already spent half my life on this. Does she think I'm a printing press? And the worst part, no gratitude. Sits in her wheelchair like a queen and expects me to jump around her. Nick lunged, trying to stand, and realized he couldn't. His arms were roughly pulled behind the back of the chair and secured with heavy metal handcuffs. His legs were shackled at the ankles to the legs of a massive steel chair, which, in turn, was welded firmly to the concrete floor. Panic, sharp and blind, hit his temples. He blinked, trying to adjust to the dark. Directly in front of him, on the wall, a huge screen glowed. There was no image on it, only sound waves pulsating in time with his own venomous voice. It was a recording, the very one he had made 3 weeks ago, calling his friend Mark after a particularly nasty fight with Jessica. And it's not like there's any sex. I can't even remember what that is. He continued to hear himself. She can't do anything at all. Just a piece of meat that needs to be fed and cleaned up after. I figured out how to bail. Told her I'm going on a business trip. but I'll actually head to the mountains for a week. When I get back, I'll say there were layoffs at the office and I got fired. Like, sorry Jess, but it's time for you to go back to your mom. I can't support you anymore. She'll buy it. She's naive like a child. Nick felt physically sick. He tried to scream, "Turn it off!" But his own voice, loud and clear, drowned out any attempt he made to make a sound. And then his eyes began to make out details in the darkness. He was in the center of a spacious, empty room, like an abandoned warehouse or garage. Water dripped somewhere in the distance, and directly opposite him, about 5 meters away, sat Jessica. She was sitting in her wheelchair, the same modern maneuverable one he had reluctantly bought 6 months ago. She was wearing her favorite gray sweater. Her hands rested on the armrests, and in one of them she clutched some object. Nick froze, peering. It was a remote, black, plastic with a single large red button illuminated from within by a sinister crimson light. His gaze traveled higher, to her face. It was motionless, pale as marble. Her eyes, usually so lively and kind, were empty and dry. She wasn't crying. She was just looking at him and listening to every word, every foul, treacherous word pouring from the screen. And then he saw the collar, a wide metal one, buckled tightly around her thin, fragile neck. And from inside it, like the teeth of some hellish beast, protruded sharp, long spikes, their points aimed directly at her throat and carotid artery. Any sudden movement, any attempt to remove it, and she would die, but she wasn't chained. Her wheelchair stood freely. She could leave, just turn around and leave. At that same moment, his own voice on the recording fell silent. And deafening silence fell, heavier than any noise, and from the darkness, from the same speakers, another voice sounded. Impersonal, mechanical, devoid of any emotion. Nick. He flinched, yanking the handcuffs. Jessica didn't even blink. Your words are a weapon. The voice was quiet, but every word seared into his consciousness like a red-hot nail. Today, your life depends on them. Nick tried to say something, but only a hoarse whisper escaped his dry throat. Your lies have chained you. The mechanism of the handcuffs clicked, tightening even more on his wrists. Her truth will set her free. Nick's gaze locked onto Jessica again, onto the remote in her hand. She has heard this recording. He understood. She knew. She knew everything. She had heard every vile, despicable syllable. And now in her hands is the detonator for your collar. An icy wave of fear washed over him. He looked down at his torso and only now noticed the heavy metal band constricting his own chest, the same as hers, with the same spikes pointing inward, towards his heart and lungs. She can leave this room a free person simply by pressing the button. The button, the very same red one that she clutched in her thin, elegant hand. Say to her face now everything you said behind her back. Convince her to press it. A pause. The silence became absolute. Or die a hypocrite. The voice fell silent. The screen went dark. The two of them were left in utter darkness, illuminated only by the sinister red glow of the button. Nick sat, paralyzed with horror. His mind refused to believe what was happening. This was a bad dream, a hallucination, a cruel joke. Jess. His voice sounded hoarse and unnaturally loud in the silence. Jess, sweetheart, that wasn't me. That's... He fell silent. What could he say? That it wasn't him. The recording spoke for itself. She was silent. Her face was a stone mask. Only her fingers tapped lightly on the plastic of the remote. Listen, he spoke again, desperation creeping into his voice. This is a trap. They want you to do it. Don't give in. We have to think. Find a way out together. She shook her head. Slowly, almost imperceptibly. Her lips trembled but made no sound. Her gaze held not hatred. Much worse, the deepest disappointment and pain. The pain he himself had caused. I didn't mean it. He suddenly shouted, feeling tears welling up in his eyes. I was stressed. I had problems at work. I was just venting. You know I always say too much when I'm angry. He was thinking feverishly, looking for a way out, an angle, a game plan. He could always find words to manipulate her, to play the victim. They made it all up. Edited it. They want to turn us against each other. Jess, we love each other. Remember. He was buying time, trying to sound as sincere as possible. He tried to catch her eye, to find in it a grain of the old love, the old trust, but her eyes remained empty. She had heard his voice on the recording. That voice wasn't the voice of a stressed man. It was the voice of a man who had thought it all through, weighed it all up, and made a cold, calculated decision. Okay. He changed tactics, pretending to be broken. Okay, I said it. I'm a scumbag. I'm a bastard. I don't deserve you. But for God's sake, that doesn't mean you have to become a murderer. Drop that remote. Give us a chance. I'll make it right. I'll take care of you. I'll dedicate my life to you. He spoke passionately, convincingly, almost starting to believe his own lie. He saw something stir in her eyes. Doubt, pity. Please, Jessica. His voice broke into a whisper. Don't press the button. I'm begging you. She slowly raised her hand with the remote. Her finger rested on the large red button. Nick's heart stopped. No. He screamed at the top of his lungs, thrashing against the handcuffs. No, don't do it. I admitted it. I confessed. What more do you want from me? She froze. Her finger still rested on the button, but didn't press it. She looked at him, and for the first time in this entire nightmare, her lips trembled, and she spoke. Her voice was quiet, hoarse from long silence, but absolutely firm. You didn't confess, Nick. You just got scared. You said what you thought I wanted to hear. You always do that. He fell silent, stunned. She saw right through him. She always had. Tell me to my face now, she continued, and there wasn't a hint of hesitation in her voice. Tell me I'm a burden, that I'm a piece of meat, that you want to get rid of me. Say it, looking me in the eye, and I will press it, and we will both be free. Nick looked at her, and a real primal rage seized him. The rage of a cornered animal, the rage of a man whose last lie had been so easily exposed. All his fears, his self-pity, his attempts at manipulation evaporated, giving way to pure, unadulterated malice. Fine, he hissed, and his voice became low, full of hatred, exactly like on the recording. Fine, you want the truth? You'll get it. He exhaled and looked at her with such disgust that she involuntarily leaned back in her chair. Yes, you're a burden, he shouted. You didn't just break your back, you broke my life. I hate every day, every hour I'm forced to spend with you. I hate your constant complaints, your helplessness, your gratitude that's worse than a slap in the face. Do you think I don't see how you look at me? With pity, as if I'm your nurse, your slave. Yes, I want to get rid of you. I dream about it. I planned it. And you know what? The only thing I regret now is not doing it sooner. He spat it all out in one venomous volley, gasping from his own hatred. He expected her to burst into tears, for her hand to shake. But none of that happened. A strange expression appeared on her face, not grief, but relief. Finally, she had heard the real Nick, the one who always hid behind the mask of the caring boyfriend. She nodded slowly. Thank you, she said quietly, for the truth. And her finger pressed the red button. A soft, dry click sounded. Nick squeezed his eyes shut, expecting an explosion, pain, the end. But nothing happened. He opened his eyes. His collar was intact. The spikes were still pointed at him. He looked at Jessica in confusion, and only then did he see what had really happened. The click hadn't come from his collar. It had come from her restraints. The very metal collar with spikes that had constricted her neck clicked open and fell into her lap with a dull thud. She was free. Nick sat, unable to comprehend. He looked from her to his own untouched collar. The impersonal voice came from the speakers again. The truth set her free, Nick, and your lies. The screen lit up again with the recording of his voice, the one he had just spoken. His hypocritical pleas, his false confessions, his manipulations. Left you here. The mechanism in his handcuffs and leg irons clicked, locking even more firmly. You couldn't tell her the truth. You lied again, until the very end. Jessica, without looking at him, moved away from her spot. She wheeled herself to the wall, and a hidden door slid silently aside, opening an exit from this hell. Enjoy the sound of your own voice. You will be listening to it for a long time. The voice fell silent. The door behind Jessica began to close slowly. Nick snapped out of it. "No!" he roared. "Jess! Come back, I did what you asked. I told the truth. Come back and let me go." She stopped in the doorway and turned for the last time. There was no gloating in her eyes, no vengeance, only infinite sadness. "No, Nick," she said softly. "You told the truth only when you thought it would kill me. And when you realized you were wrong, you started lying again. You haven't changed, and you never will." The door closed with a quiet hiss. Nick was left alone, in complete darkness, in his collar, and with the eternally looped recording of his own, lying, venomous voice now playing for him alone. "You see, she's just become absolutely unbearable," he screamed, but his cry was drowned in a sea of his own betrayal.